Welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. You are listening to a podcast by Pastor Eric Siepen and Pastor Andy Littleton. If you enjoy Faith Over Breakfast, we encourage you to rate it on the Apple Podcast app, on Spotify, or Google Play. Thank you and enjoy the podcast. Welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. My name is Pastor Eric Siepen from the Village Church, and across from me is first name Pastor
First
Andy.
name Pastor, middle name Andy, last name Littleton.
Mission Church in Tucson, Arizona. And Andy, not just, but just
Recently.
finished an interview with
James Martin,
and a book he wrote called "Come Forth" is the subject of this interview.
"Come Forth: The Promise of Jesus' Greatest Miracle," and it's about the raising of Lazarus. And it was an exciting opportunity. We've been reached out to several times by Peter, a promoter for publishing companies, about books coming out, and this one came through our email, and I was intrigued, and I became more intrigued after I read the book.
Yeah,
and
you like crash coursed it, and that gave you some opportunities to ask him some really good questions about Lazarus and his resurrection, and also you know some information about the tomb and just some changes from Jesus's time to now and what pilgrimages are like and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, there's so much good stuff in this interview, and much more, of course. If you read the book, you'll think about Israel and Palestine. You'll think about God's power to raise people from the dead. There's even little touches in there about like different ways that Protestants and Catholics might think about the meaning of things like this, and more. It was an enjoyable interview for me. I believe this is one of the rare ones where I went, wow, I kind of wish we could have doubled the time. It was really good. So I really hope you enjoy this conversation with Jim, as he is happy to be called by his friends. And if you're listening to this, you're his friend, I think. And but yeah, James Martin from the Society of Jesus, accredited by the Jesuits. So we are just happy to host this conversation.
Yeah. So thanks, Jim, for it, and everybody enjoy.
All right, well, I am here with James Martin, a Jesuit priest who has recently written the book, Come Forth: The Promise of Jesus' Greatest Miracle, which centers on the raising of Lazarus. And Jim, it is good to be with you.
Good to be with you too, Andy. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. Well, I've got a few questions for you. We're just going to jump in, and but I'm going to be having a conversation with Eric, my friend, about this as well. So we will unpack this a little bit. So hopefully most of this space is for you, Jim. So to me, to begin, this book went a little bit beyond its categories. So I looked on the back and I saw Christian living. And as I read it and experienced it, I found it to have elements of memoir and theology and Christian history. And so I wanted you to explain this book to us. Tell us a little bit about why it's not just your typical Christian living read and why it's so special to you.
Yeah, in fact, this is the first time I'm realizing that it was categorized under Christian living, which it definitely is. It's about life and it's about Christianity. It's a kind of mix of things. So it's a deep dive into the story of the raising of Lazarus, which I'm sure most of your listeners know is in the Gospel of John. It's Jesus' raising his friend Lazarus from the dead. But it's a mix of biblical study. So we look at the text pretty much in depth, in an inviting way, not in a super academic way, although I use a lot of scholars. It's a little bit of spirituality. So what does this story have to do with our lives today as Christians, Christian living? It's a little bit of travelogue as I take you to the places where it actually happened. Bethany, which is today called very beautifully Al-Azariah, which means the place of Lazarus in Arabic. They retain that name. And finally, a little bit of a cultural history, kind of a cultural history of Lazarus through the fine arts, and for the last 2,000 years, plays, novels, poetry, that kind of stuff, and sort of seeing him from a kind of cultural point of view. So it mixes all those things together to really kind of go as deep as we can into that story that is such a powerful read for so many people and has meant so much for me and to me, for my whole life.
Absolutely, and I really appreciated the weaving in of all those elements. I liked the art. Thank you for sharing all of that, and it really is a quite enjoyable read. It surprised me in many ways.
Well, thanks. I mean, I enjoyed the art too, and it's funny. I guess about halfway through the book, I thought, I should put pictures in this book. And I asked my publisher, and they said, given the way that books are published these days, it's all just, what do you call it, digitized. So the words are digitized the same way that the images are. And they said, yeah, that's no problem. So I love having books with pictures and images and maps. And they said, yeah, sure. So a lot of those were on Wiki Commons, and you get a sense of how Lazarus has been portrayed throughout the centuries, which I just think is just fascinating.
Absolutely, it really it brought it to life. Okay, so one of the surprises to me as I read the book was this exploration of the possibility that Lazarus was actually the Book of John's beloved disciple. So, slight spoiler, but the as I read that, I thought, sometimes it can be scary to consider a way of understanding the Bible we aren't used to. How would you encourage readers to approach this potentially paradigm shifting possibility in a text that they depend on as a core, having core tenets of their faith in it? How do you balance that desire for fidelity and maybe a new possibility within Scripture?
Yeah, well, the first thing is it's not challenging anything fundamental like, the resurrection or the incarnation or anything like that, or the miracles or anything. And I say at the beginning of the book, I believe in the story of Lazarus. Like, I don't believe it in a vague way, but I believe that it actually happened that way. I think, the beloved disciple, who's a kind of mysterious figure in John's gospel, has always been sort of disputed. Who is it? Is it the writer of John's gospel? Is it the Apostle Thomas? Is it this person? Is it that person? And I lay out the case, which is something that many more contemporary scholars think, that it might be Lazarus for a couple of reasons. And I would say this: I don't think people's faith would be shaken, if they say the beloved disciple is not, say, John, the son of Zebedee, and it's Lazarus. I mean, because the gospel is still about Jesus Christ. But it's a kind of more fundamental question about, how we shouldn't fear biblical scholarship. The more we know about the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth, the more we know about the gospels, the more we can understand what he's talking about and what he meant. So I've always thought that people who feel, and I know it's kind of a common thing, I don't want to read Bible commentaries because it's just going to ruin things. No, I mean, you want to know as much as you can about Jesus, right? And so why would you want to know as much as you can about the Gospels and his life and time? So for me, it's always increased my faith and my interest in Jesus to just, kind of dig deep and look at these things. So I think the sort of identity of the beloved disciple is not going to shake anybody's faith. It's more of a kind of a detective story, like, who really was it? And there's no conclusion. I think it's likely that it might be Lazarus, but I don't think we're going to know until we get to heaven, Well,
I found it to be an intriguing possibility. It got my gears turning.
Yeah.
I'm accused in my church of spoiling movies and books, and so I'm going to stop. But hey, read the book. It's an interesting thing to consider. And you're right. There are quite a few scholars that had some thoughts on it as well. So
yeah, and it's kind of fun to have a little bit of a detective story. Like, who is this guy? No one's ever really said it is definitively this person, and we're never going to know because John's gospel doesn't identify him. It's probably not a her, because some people say it's Mary Magdalene, but at the end of, at the crucifixion, Jesus says, "Son, here's your mother." So that's kind of unlikely. But I'll leave it up to the reader to make their determination. I think it's kind of a fun detective story, though.
Absolutely. Well, so this book, as you mentioned earlier, is deepened by your own pilgrimages to Israel and the tomb of Lazarus. And I have not had the opportunity to visit any of these places myself, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners will be in the same boat. But as I read your account, the divide between Israel and Palestine that even stood between Jerusalem and Bethany stood out to me. It was something that became a little more real to me reading your book. And then elsewhere in the book, you talked about the unfortunate anti-Semitism that can result in a misreading of the book of John. So I assume you were writing this before the current news, right, about Israel and Gaza. As a frequent pilgrim, what would you like readers to understand about the political climate in that part of the world? And just and how would you like us to imagine the Bible in light of what you've seen?
It's a great question. And I'm realizing just as one of the things about writing a book and being interviewed by it is that you realize, oh, okay, I'm glad that was in the book. I wish that were in the book, and I'm glad that I sort of gave equal weight to the situation of the Palestinians and also the situation of the Jews, right, throughout history. What I would like them to understand, people understand, is that it's very complex. It's extremely complex. I think the best way, look, I'm not a politician, and on all these, and the book steers away from politics. It just sort of lays out, this is where Bethany is. It's in Palestinian territory. These are the things that we need to avoid in terms of John's gospel, in terms of anti-Semitism, just kind of laying it out. I think the most helpful thing that I heard was when I was over there was this, that the Israelis feel besieged and beleaguered, and in a minority because they're in the Middle East, right? They're sort of surrounded and they're in the Middle East, which is true. The Palestinians within Israel feel the same way, that they're besieged and beleaguered. And so you have these two groups who both feel the same way, who have to live with one another. And I just think it is just this immense tragedy, obviously, because I mean, I know Israeli Jews and I know Palestinian Muslims, and I know Palestinian. There's a lot of Palestinian Christians. I think a lot of people forget. When you go over like Bethlehem, there's a lot of Palestinian Christians and Catholics who are there in Bethlehem, increasingly fewer. So it's just a tragedy. And I think what I would say is, to avoid kind of simplistic answers and simplistic analyses of what's going on, and to read kind of deeply about the history of both of these peoples who, as I said, have felt besieged and beleaguered, throughout history. It is amazing to me, though, that, Jesus comes into this kind of same kind of world. I mean, he comes into a world that is, as you know, violent and political and complicated, and where people are at each other's throats, in his time, the Romans and the Jews and the Samaritans. So, he does understand this. And when we pray to Jesus, we pray to someone who understands what the real world is like, because he lived in the real world.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah. I remember seeing a Rick Steves show where he just spent time on each side and just in the area. And that was a surprisingly very helpful accidental thing that I saw. I just caught it on TV and I thought, wow, I need more insight. I need more just basic exposure to this.
Yeah.
area.
And I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking, when you go to Jerusalem and you see this wall, it's a 30-foot high wall. And you can't get from Jerusalem to Bethany any longer. You used to be able to walk over the Mount of Olives, take the same path that Jesus did, and you can't any longer. And it's a really stark reminder of the divisions. And I say in the book that the Israelis call it the security wall, the Palestinians call it the separation wall. So it's even the names of things is really difficult. I think for me, though, it still remains this a place that really attracts me and really moves me. And I will say this, to stand where Jesus stood and to say, undisputably, Jesus saw this. I mean, when you're at the Sea of Galilee, I always say to people, there's only one Sea of Galilee, right? And so this is it. So Jesus saw this, and the same city walls that he would have seen, on his way to the crucifixion, and, when he visited Jerusalem, I still get goosebumps thinking about that. You're seeing the same thing that his eyes saw. And it really grounds the Gospels. And the same going to Bethany. Bethany has always been here. This is where he raised Lazarus. So it's very moving for me to think about that. That's why I put a lot of pictures in the book, because a lot of us aren't going to be able to go.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Well, one of the themes that you draw upon in the book is the anger and struggle that some people have, many of us have, as we deal with our belief, our doubts, our struggles. You showed in the lives of the disciples and Jesus' friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus in Bethany. You show it in Jesus' moment of being deeply moved, even to anger in the face of death itself, perhaps as he thought about his own death to come, as he saw a friend had died. What place do these, what we often might call negative emotions, have in the Christian life?
Yeah, what a great question. I mean, God's been dealing with those emotions since the time of, gosh, the Psalms at least and before. I think, one of the things that we can say, and thank you for explicating it like that, is that it's natural and it's human. If even Jesus got frustrated and angry, he does get angry at times, which is, we believe as Christians, as I know you do, Jesus is fully human, fully divine. In the Catholic Church, a lot of Catholics can tend to kind of set aside the human part. And when you say Jesus got angry or Jesus did this or he lost his temper, people say, no, he can't do that. Well, he's fully human and he has fully human emotions. So that's the first thing, that they're natural. The second thing is when you look at Martha and Mary in the story of Lazarus' sisters, who come to Jesus, who meet Jesus when Jesus has delayed coming to heal their brother. And they say, if you had been here, our brother would not have died. It's very strong. They're being very honest with him. And it's an invitation to be honest with God in our lives and in prayer, I think. And one of the reasons that Martha and Mary are able to be honest with Jesus is that they know him so well. And we're only honest with people. Look, I don't know you, right? I've met you, right? I'm not going to be angry or rude to you. No way, right? If we're buddies or friends or we're on like a road trip or something, I might, you're a little bit more open with people that you know well. And so it's an invitation, while we always keep God in reverence and in awe. The closer you are with God, the more intimacy that I think God invites us to with God. And the more you're honest with God, the closer you get. And so it's kind of this deepening circle. So I think it tells us that these negative emotions are natural, and we shouldn't be afraid to share them with God, who's heard them for a long time, and Jesus experienced them.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that. I think you can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but you show your cards in the book stating to whoever your audience might be that you indeed believe that Lazarus and Jesus were real people and that Lazarus was indeed raised from the dead. Why does a doctrine that's so supernatural like the resurrection, why is it worth holding on to in our day?
Gosh, you mean Jesus's resurrection, just in general?
The possibility of any and all of it.
Well, I mean, okay, the way I would look at it is this, that I believe it happened. So it's something to believe in, right? It's not simply kind of a category or a theory. That I believe in, like capitalism or democracy, I mean, it's something that really happened. That's the first thing. But I think, and there's a couple of things to think about. First of all, Jesus tells us over and over and over again that he promises people eternal life. I mean, he says that multiple times in the Gospels. He shows us that by raising three people from the dead, Lazarus most dramatically, the subject of the book, but also the widow of Nain's son, Jairus's daughter, right? And he himself, which frankly, I didn't realize that. One of these things, you start researching a book and you say, oh, okay, I guess that makes more sense. Jesus himself says he's raising people from the dead. Remember when John the Baptist has his friends go over and say, "You the one who is to come," he says, and frankly, I never really kind of recognized this, "Go tell John what you see, the lame walk, the deaf hear, the dead are raised." I mean, he's saying, I'm doing this. And then the third thing he does is he kind of reveals eternal life in the resurrection. And the promise of new life and the promise of eternal life with God has always made sense to me. I've always thought, look, does it make sense that God has a relationship with Andy and Eric? That's your colleague, right? Why would God destroy those things? Why would God suddenly say, I'm going to snuff that out? This loving relationship, it makes zero sense to me. And so the resurrection is this promise of new life. But also I would say this, that the Paschal mystery, this kind of life and death, is something we see as a pattern in our lives. When we kind of die to things or let things go, we experience new life. And so it's also a very human, it's a very human journey. So it's not only something that's supernatural that Christ promises us and reveals us, but it's something we experience, the Paschal mystery. Something dies in order to, bring new life to something else. It's also part of our lives on earth.
Yeah.
I'm a big resurrection person. That's kind of the center of my faith, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, it's, I don't know if you're noticing something that I'm noticing, but it felt like early in my, I guess, career in ministry, it felt like there was so much skepticism around the possibility of supernatural events. But today, the climate in the culture, at least where I am, at least in Tucson, is that skepticism has lost some hold. There's a lot more openness to spiritual things. That's just there's a struggle to define what they might be. This is speaking culturally. Are you seeing similar things? More of an openness to believe in things like resurrection in our culture in general?
That's an interesting point. I'm not sure. I mean, I could just as easily expect you to say I'm seeing more skepticism, because I think the culture is getting more secular overall. So there's you see trends in terms of not only like attending church, but just believing in God. And so you might say, well, there's kind of a general movement away towards the supernatural. I don't know. My sense is that people still find it hard to believe in that stuff because it's not rational and they can't get their minds around it and they don't have proof. By the same token, it's funny. I was just watching this on YouTube. I think there's testimonies now that you see about, for example, near-death experiences and experiences that people have that I think are more generally available now. And that I do think it's harder for people to dismiss that. I went down a near-death experience wormhole the other day on YouTube. And, some of these stories and experiences, I would say, which have 25 million views, and they're remarkably similar. And I think perhaps in terms of social media, people have more of an exposure to other people that they might not have had exposure to before. So I'm not sure. I think there's two things going on. I think there might be a little bit more of an interest at a openness to mystery, but I do think people are kind of getting more secular, and I don't know. I'm kind of curious where you experience that people are more open to kind of the possibility of miracles and things like that.
Yeah. No, we're a church of mostly 20 and 30-year-olds. And one of the themes of the recent conversions has been really profound spiritual encounters that I haven't seen in my ministry or my life, and they don't feel like they're coming from an expectation within the Christian community. They're actually it's people have been coming into our community saying, "Hey, I had this experience. Wow. Can you help me interpret it?" There's a lot of I've been influenced by people like Andrew Root, who's kind of talking about the ages of secularism. And one of the ideas of kind of our age that he brings up is that there's more of an openness to encounter than ever before. That doesn't mean that it's still a secular version of that. It's an openness to anything, whatever it might be. But one of my little pieces of evidence that I give when I have conversations about this is at least our city's post-Christian in most definitions, meaning that most people didn't grow up with Christianity as the intellectual furniture with which they're viewing the world. They grew up without that. But if you go into our very popular local bookstore, all of the impulse buys, everything around the counter, everything that you're being encouraged to purchase, right before you finish your purchase. I shouldn't say all of it. It seems 50% are spiritual. There's occult, there's dark magic, but it's spiritual. It's all kinds of spiritual, and I'm seeing. I'm just seeing more of an openness to it in the younger generation. Yeah, well, I don't think that clears everything up or means that people are more Christian or would sign on to believing in a particular God, though.
That's very well said, and I think you're right. I think there is an openness to encounter. I also think as you were talking, I'm thinking out loud that as things become less sure for people and less stable economically, socially, certainly politically in the United States, there is this kind of casting about for what is real. And I think perhaps, it's funny you should say that. Perhaps the fact that people are unchurched means that they may in some way be more open to spiritual experience because it doesn't come mediated through the church, which they reject. And they say, I'm just thinking about this. And I think you're right that because it doesn't have the baggage of church, if you have a spiritual experience, it's sort of like, well, what do I do with this? And maybe before he would have said, oh, that's churchy, or that's not me. But now there may be more openness to it. And God's always active. And I think one of the things that I heard years ago from a Jesuit friend of mine, which I thought was wonderful, is that, because I do a lot of spiritual direction and retreats and stuff, is that, people are always having spiritual experiences, but they're not, and this is my favorite word, encouraged to talk about it.
Yeah.
And I think that because, I think people just, a lot of times they say, oh, I was just emotional.
Well, and one of the byproducts of kind of pervasive rationalism was that you felt like a fool to bring that stuff up. I mean, I felt like that in my younger years. I had some pretty big experience. I was just talking this over with two younger folks in our church, and I had some pretty impactful experiences, but they felt very much like intimate things you didn't say because people would cast doubt on it, and maybe I was afraid they would, activate my own doubts about it. Today, it just seems like the climate's a little different. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry. I think it's a good point, and I think people maybe in this generation are a little more open to talking about their feelings than they would have been, when I was growing up. I also think, to your point, and this is about religious experiences, I think they're really hard to verbalize.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't a vision. I didn't hear it, but I sort of felt it. I kind of heard I heard the words, but I didn't hear them. They came to my mind, but they weren't, that kind of stuff. And I think one of the most important things that priests and pastors and ministers can do is, as my friend said, encourage people to talk about them and to say, I mean, I've been a Jesuit for like 35 years, and I feel like, short of someone seeing a vision, I think I've heard it all. And so to be able to say to a person, yeah, that's fine, and that's natural, and that's the way that God is working with you, and that's great. And you may not expect it again. It may not happen again. It may not happen to someone else, but this is how God is being very personal with you. So yeah, I think that's an interesting point.
Well, and the Lazarus story proves that a bit. He was raised from the dead, that one time.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
But I think, one of the themes of the book is that, God's always calling all of us to new life. That's the kind of spiritual sort of overarching theme of the book. And I think one of the ways that God does that is by speaking to us in ways that only we can understand, and sometimes we can only articulate. I mean, sometimes we can't articulate in a particularly helpful way. I sometimes think that some of the mystical visions that we read about in Christian theology, and even some of the stuff that happened in the Bible, are people trying to explain it, in ways that are going to make sense. But these are experiences that we, like the Transfiguration. His face was whiter than any bleacher could bleach it, it's kind of their very homey way of saying this is something that this is how it seemed, but words really can't do it justice. Which I think is kind of beautiful. To me, that's more of a proof, that it doesn't really seem to be as precise as you would want. But like the resurrection, we get back to that. Jesus looks like Jesus, but he sort of doesn't.
Yeah.
Sometimes they recognize him and they say it is the Lord. The beloved disciple says that. Sometimes they say it's a ghost. He's physical, he's not physical. And so in this, I see, as I say in the book, I see real authenticity, because they're doing their best to try to explain this experience that was kind of unexplainable.
Yeah.
To me, that's more, that I believe that more than if they were like word for word the same. Like, let's agree on how we're going to present this.
As if they put it in a petri dish and described it to you, right?
Or as if they were trying to like argue it and like make some sort of airtight case. But one of my most enjoyable things to think about is the resurrection, and really, truly, at the tomb, Mary Magdalene doesn't recognize him. What is that about? Yeah. But then, of course, as soon as they see him on the shore, they say it's Jesus. So somehow he looked like himself. Somehow he didn't. And I think part of the sort of the mystery is to say, I can believe in this without fully understanding it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I love that. That's really helpful to be reminded of, because, sometimes the way I've thought about it is, if you could comprehend it quite simply, you might be dealing with a God that you've created yourself.
Oh,
If it's hard to describe, if you can't quite comprehend it, you might be encountering an actual God, and pay attention to that, right?
I think Thomas Aquinas said, if you can understand it, it's not God.
Yeah, yeah,
And the other one I love is a pocket-sized God. Have you ever heard that expression? A pocket-sized God is a God that's like, you put in your pocket, it's very like manageable. Like, okay,
yeah.
this is God. I put him in a little box and I take him out when I need it versus this awesome mystery. And the same with Jesus. And as I say in the Come Forth book, that people have a hard time understanding him. And even when he's raising Lazarus from the dead, people are still like, where were you and what's going on? And it's still a hard story for people to grasp. So endlessly rich.
Well, my final question is, so you talk about the physical raising of Lazarus from the dead, but as you did just a moment ago, you showed that it could kind of be a symbol or a metaphor for a change, an inward change of becoming, I believe you said, we're unfree and moving toward freedom. As a Protestant, I think that there's a general fear of the metaphor sometimes. I think that we as a tradition have struggled with the metaphor. There was Charles Haddon Spurgeon. He did it. He's the only one ever. But our Catholic brothers and sisters, there's a better heritage of employing the metaphor. How can it be helpful to see something like Lazarus's resurrection as symbolizing more than just that historic, or his raising, as more than just that historic moment itself, but as actually bearing in it something symbolic? How can that be helpful?
That's a great question. And I want to start off by saying, as I start off the book, by saying, I believe that this happened. So I want to be clear. Like, I believe that if you were in Bethany that day, you might not be word for word, but that happened, that Jesus came, he raised Lazarus from the dead. But I think, the question is, what does that story mean for us today, beyond just the fact that we believe that Jesus raised this person 2,000 years ago? And I think it really is a beautiful invitation for us to say to ourselves, where are the places in our lives that we can sort of let go of things and let them die in the tomb, that we can let go of the things that keep us unfree, bound, stuck, and move out into new life? Because I really think that, when we look at the scriptures in both ways, as something that happened that we believe in, but also as something that holds meaning for us today and can give us lessons, right? I think we're on firm ground. So I have no trouble with both believing that it happened, literally, and having faith in that, and saying this: it is not just a story about Jesus raising a guy 2,000 years ago. It's a story about us. And I think the whole Bible is like that. It's so when you think about, I think people, if they think about sort of the resurrection, that's easier for them. I'm looking for new life in my life. I'm looking for, hope and things like that. But I think all the gospel stories admit of that sort of entrance into them personally. And that is a big Catholic thing. And it's a big Jesuit thing too, kind of finding yourself in the story and saying, what does God mean for me to take from this story in addition to the belief? So I think the metaphor is really powerful.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I know you only have so much time, and you've given Eric and I and whoever else I might chat with a lot to chew on. So thank you so much for your time, and we just really appreciate it. Where's the best place for these people to buy the book? I'm sure it's available everywhere. Is there a place that just benefits you the most for them to buy it?
Believe it or not, because I'm a Jesuit, all the royalties go to the Jesuits because I take a vow of poverty. So
there you go.
I would
What's best
say
for the Jesuits?
Yeah, right. I'd say really it's available in print, ebook, and audio, read by yours truly. It has pictures, I want to say again. But really, anywhere books are sold, online and bookstores, you can go anywhere, and I'd be happy if you bought it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for joining us, and we really, really appreciate the work that you've done.
My pleasure. Thanks, Andy. God bless you and Eric.
All right. Well, there's the interview, the time I had with Jim, and Eric. Thanks for sitting in and giving it a listen with me.
You're welcome.
And so, yeah, it was such an enjoyable interview. I really, really enjoyed this, and just want to encourage you all. This there is some sense out there, and we didn't really get into it in this time, but he can sometimes be called a progressive Jesuit. And I think every once in a while that will scare somebody off in certain circles. It's either an allure or a fear. And I would say this book stands alone outside of that title of, not one that he's signed up for, but outside of that label that's been placed upon him. It's just a well done piece of work. Researched. It is absolutely not only worth the read, but it will invite you to think more deeply. I believe to have more hope, more faith in what God can do, and to even expand some of your ideas of what's possibly going on. In this story and in the book of John and all around it. So I highly recommend the book. It got a 5-star rating on Goodreads from me. Hopefully you all read, rate, and really, engage this book. It's worth it.
Speaking of rating, you've been listening to Faith Over Breakfast, which is a podcast that you can find out all over the world. And some obscure rating companies rate us in the top 20 podcasts of Christian podcasts you should listen to.
And here's my view on that. The more obscure the rating group, the less likely they are to know who we are.
Yeah.
So that's a very high rating. That's like being the Billboard number 5.
Yeah, we're up there with, all the big names.
That's right.
So,
To all of you running obscure podcast rating sites, thank you.
Thank you for rating us this
doing
year.
that. I hope it's working out for you.
Yeah, it's great. But you can rate us on Apple and on Spotify. You can support us.
Google. Buzzsprout is our hosting site. Or you go to faithoverbreakfast.com and check us out from there.
Anywhere.
Yeah.
And you can support us.
Yeah.
$3, $5, and $10 a month. It's real easy. It just comes right out of your bank account. You don't even have to think about it. $3. Nobody. Wow. It's a coffee for the price of a coffee, man.
That's right, and even better than that, truly better than that, is if you are listen, and if there's something you're hoping we would discuss. See, if I'd never gotten this email about Lazarus, we wouldn't have talked about it.
Yeah,
and there's always good stuff in there when we get a topic suggestion. So faithoverbreakfast@gmail.com. You can interact after a podcast with us. You can ask us a question. You can suggest a podcast topic. We really do enjoy when you do that.
Yes.
So, I hope you take the time to rate, think of a question, reach out, and thank you for tuning into Faith Over Breakfast.
Yeah, thank you very much. You've been listening to Faith Over Breakfast with Pastor Eric Siepen and Pastor Andy Littleton. Please share us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Thank you.